Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Lorna Gibson. She's a professor of materials science and engineering at MIT. Her new book, Birds Up Close, is about the fact that she's been a lifelong birdwatcher. In the book, she explores the marvel of how birds work from her perspective as an engineer and a lifelong birder. She looks at the hidden microscopic structures and engineering principles that keep birds aloft and alive. Welcome to the show, Lorna.
Thanks very much.
It's great to have you with us. So what made you want to put this book together and where did you start?
Well, I've written several academic books, and after I finished the last one, I thought I'd like to write a book for a more general audience. And I thought that the thing I did my research on, I didn't think that many people would be interested in, but I'm a birder, and I thought maybe birds would be a good vehicle for talking a little bit about engineering and the sort of principles that make birds work. So that's kind of how I got interested in it. And then I started by just reading ornithology textbooks and then looking up, scientific journal papers that they referred to. I started meeting with ornithologists and talking to them. So I visited a few ornithologists and talked to them about their work. And the book really just reflects things that I thought were interesting. It's not comprehensive in any way. It's just things I thought was interesting.
Yeah. And do you think it brings a unique perspective coming from it from an engineering point of view?
I really think it does. As I was writing the book, I started giving talks based on it, and mostly to birders, not to academic audiences. And people loved it. And I think it was that different perspective. It was a different way of looking at birds. There's a lot of microscopy in the book, electron microscope images of feathers. There's microcomputed tomography of bones. And most people haven't had a chance to see things like that. And when you show them and explain all the properties of feathers that arise from the structure, people get quite interested in it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think most people, unless they're particularly interested in birds or the structure of birds, as you say, will just think of feathers as a good luck charm. If a feather lands from the sky, sometimes feathers can remind us of loved ones who have passed away. It can be a sign, or people can see it as a sign, as a loved one saying hello. But to really understand the structure of a feather and how they work for the birds is fascinating, something a lot of people probably haven't thought about.
I think that's it. People haven't really thought about it. And when you explain it to them, they're like, oh, wow, that's really neat. And, I think birds are amazing for their colors, for the way they fly. I mean, a lot of people love birds just looking at them, flying around in nature. But this is really looking at the insides of the birds in a way that people haven't really, or at least, your average birder hasn't done before. And I guess I should say the book's really based on other people's research. It's not my research. It's really me looking at the literature and trying to bring it together and explain it in a way that the average birder would understand.
One of the things you talk about with regards to the feathers, all the different properties that they have and what they enable the bird to do, enabling flight, insulating against the cold, repel water, even controlling sound. That's incredible.
It was incredible. And as I was researching it, I would find all these things out about the birds or the feathers or whatever. And I was amazed. I mean, I couldn't believe it. When you look at something like iridescence in a feather, a hummingbird, as it moves back and forth, the color kind of shimmers and changes, and that's the iridescence. And that iridescence is created by tiny little microscopic structures within the feather that have a size about the same as the wavelength of light. They're tenths of microns, and a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. And these very precisely controlled structures give you the iridescence in a feather. And things like the insulation of down, water birds, especially in the winter, have to keep warm, and the outer feathers repel water and the down insulates them. And it's really the structure of both the outer feathers that allows them to be water repellent and the structure of the down that allows it to insulate the bird. And it's really fascinating looking at the structure of the feathers. And, as a material scientist, I had never really thought to look at feathers until I did this book. And it's really kind of amazing.
Definitely. Even the idea of them repelling water, I hadn't ever thought about. When you see birds in water, loving being in the water, whether it's ducks or whatever it might be, swimming along, and you just assume that, well, I have anyway, just assumed that they're wet.
Yeah, well, the outside of the feather does get wet, but a lot of people thought for many years that it was preen oil. Birds have a gland at the base of their tail called the preen gland, and it exudes oil. And you sometimes see birds poking their bill into that preen gland and then running their bill through their feathers and running, the oil over their feathers. And people thought that was what made it the water repellent. But in fact, it doesn't. You can clean that oil off the feathers, and the feathers are still water repellent. And it really is the structure of the feathers. And there's a nice kind of story behind it. There were two guys in England during World War II, Cassie and Baxter, and they worked at the Wool Industries Research Association, which here in the States, I just think that's such an incredibly English kind of name. But anyways, they wanted to make British Army clothing, which was made of wool. They wanted to make it more water repellent. And the wool is made up of fibers, and they started looking at what would make fibers more water repellent. And they did some calculations, and eventually they looked at duck feathers, and they were able to predict the water repellency of duck feathers. And they were never able to make a water repellent clothing based on that. But if you go out and buy a raincoat today, it has something called a DWR coating on it, a durable water repellent coating. And that coating has little tiny posts, on a microscopic scale, little tiny posts that stick up vertically. And it's based on the lotus leaf structure, which is also very water repellent. And people who've analyzed the lotus leaf, they use the equations that Cassie and Baxter developed for duck feathers. Gosh. So, the duck feathers were sort of parallel rods in the vein of the feather, sort of horizontally, and the lotus leaf is sort of vertical rods. So there's a different geometry. But the sort of principles behind it were discovered by Cassie and Baxter in World War II, trying to make wool clothing more water repellent and looking at duck feathers.
Oh, amazing. Lovely. It must be brilliant when you're doing your research and you come across stories like that.
It is. And I looked up their original paper from 1944, and they have a paragraph in there basically saying if you want to make clothing more water repellent, you should look for not a waterproofing agent like some sort of wax, but instead you should look at the structure of the clothing. And that's what now people have done with these durable water repellent fabrics.
Wow. Another part of the book is you looking at the bones of birds. What did you learn from that?
Yeah, so the bones of birds, there's two main structures in the bones. Some of the bones are long and hollow. And we have tubular bones too, but our bones are filled with marrow. And some of the tubular bones in the birds are filled with marrow, but some of them are not. Some of them are filled with air. And surprisingly, to me at least, some of them are part of their respiratory system. They use the air in their bones. It's connected to their lungs and their sort of air storage. I know, it's amazing. Birds are amazing. And also, if you look at those cylindrical long bones, they're much thinner walled than a similar diameter bone would be in a mammal. And this is one of the ways that the bones are lightweight. Some of the bones are more plate-like or like a shell, like a skull, for instance, or the pelvis. And those tend to have a structure called a sandwich structure. Typically, there's the solid layers of bone on the inner and outer surface. And inside of that, there's either little tiny ribs or a little sort of spongy foam-like kind of bone in there. And that, too, is a very sort of mechanically efficient way of arranging the material. You can make, for a given stiffness or a given strength, you can make the structure lightweight by making it a sandwich structure. And some of our bones, our bones in people or bones in mammals, they're also sandwich structures. But when you look at the ones in birds, they're incredibly delicate. The little tiny struts in the foamy bit or the ribs, they're very small and delicate. And you can show that this reduces the weight of the bones too.
And do they break their bones often? Just the other day, a bird flew into my glass window door that we have in the living room. Apart from the fact feathers went everywhere, it managed to fly away again straight away, which was good. But I assumed it must have been injured. I mean, would he have broken bones doing something like that?
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the ways that quite a large number of birds die is by flying into buildings, especially tall buildings that are lit up at night in cities, and especially during migrations season. So exactly right now, actually. And there's actually efforts to get property managers to turn the lights off to try to avoid collisions of birds with windows. And they can break bones when they do that. And you can actually buy glass that has patterns on it now to try to, so the birds can see the pattern of the glass and not run into it. But it is a problem with birds running into glass.
And do you know what happens when they do break bones? I mean, if they're still able to fly, does it matter? I mean, are they in pain? Does it just rebuild itself? How does it work?
I think it would be just like us. I mean, I think if they fractured their skull, they would probably die. And, if they fractured a wing bone, they probably would have difficulty flying. And I think they would feel pain just the same as we do. Yeah. So I think it's a real problem, birds flying into windows.
Mm. Another part of the book is you looking into eggs. And I guess this is obviously different depending on the bird. Where did you start with this?
Well, like the other parts of the book, I just started reading an ornithology textbook, and I eat eggs all the time, chicken eggs, and I really hadn't known where they come from, like how they actually get made inside the bird. And so part of the book is just sort of straight from an ornithology textbook describing how the egg is formed. There's sort of an ova or an ovum, and it gets fertilized, and it goes through the oviduct, and it's almost like a little production line. There's all different processes occur at different places along this oviduct, and eventually the shell is put on and the pigment is put on. But I also talk about the size of eggs. There's an amazing range of the size of eggs. Hummingbirds have tiny little eggs, and if you look at an ostrich egg, it's sort of the size of a cantaloupe. And there are extinct birds that had even larger eggs. So there's the huge range of the size. There's a huge range of color of eggs. And part of this is for camouflage. If you look at some of the shorebirds, they really they barely even have a nest. I think they call it a scrape. They lay their eggs on a stony beach, basically. And their color of the eggs camouflages them against the color of the stones. And also I looked at what controls the shape of eggs. There was a really beautiful study done by Cassie Stoddard at Princeton and her colleagues, where they had digital images of eggs from a museum in California. So I think the museum already had these digital images. And then they sort of fit a mathematical equation to the shape of the egg. And then they looked at all sorts of different parameters that might affect the shape of the egg, like all sorts of things. This number of eggs in the clutch, the climate, where it nested. And one of the things they looked at was the flight ability, so how well a bird can fly. And some birds are kind of clumsy flyers, turkeys here in the States, or owls are, they sort of fly slowly and aren't very agile. But other birds are incredibly agile in the air. Terns in particular are very agile. And the thing they realized was that there was a correlation between the shape of the egg and the bird's flight ability. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you say you have two birds of the same size and they have eggs of the same volume, the one that's has a higher flight ability wants to be more aerodynamic and have a narrower pelvis. So if the pelvis is going to be narrower, the egg's going to be longer. And so the flight ability affects the shape of the egg. And that might not be the entire explanation, but it looks like at least that's part of the explanation for the shape of the egg.
Oh, definitely. That's amazing. And were you able to kind of work out and understand where and how the shell takes its form?
Well, that happens in the oviduct. So, after the egg is fertilized, it works its way through this oviduct. And there's the albumin gets deposited. That's the white of the egg. There's membranes get deposited. There's sort of two layers of membrane. And then the shell gets deposited it's called the shell gland. And then it's almost like little jets apply the pigment after that. And the whole process from going to where the egg's fertilized to when it's laid usually takes about a day in most birds.
Interesting. And what about the idea of the chicks or the young that will come out of the eggs? Did you look into why sometimes they might not survive, or why they might not come out of the shell at all, looking into to the birth of birds?
I didn't look into that in too much detail. Chicks within the egg have something called the egg tooth. At the tip of their bill, they have a little kind of knob, a little sharp knob, and they kind of bang that against the inside of the shell to crack the shell and to get out. One of the interesting things we found, though, looking at the literature was, the shell is made of a calcium compound, and it comes from the calcium that the mother bird eats. But as the bird is developing within the egg, the bones of the bird, it gets its calcium from the shell. And so the amount of calcium in the shell is being reduced over time as the bird is developing within the egg. And so the shell is, it's sort of easier for the chick to break the shell than it would have been when it was, at the beginning of the whole process.
Fascinating. And with regards to flying, which is, of course, probably the most impressive and fascinating thing about birds, the kind of thing that a lot of humans, if they had a superpower, is often that they would love to be able to fly. I'm really interested to know what you found out about that, why some birds can't fly, the difference in their structure as to why that happens, and how and why it's so easy for a bird to be sitting down and then off they go into the sky like it's nothing.
Yeah. Well, I think some birds have lost the ability to fly just because of evolutionary reasons. They eat things that they don't need to fly. There's a type of, I think there's a type of cormorant in the Galapagos that doesn't fly. And obviously there's birds like ostriches and emus that don't fly. And they've grown to a very large size and such a large size that, you would have to have huge wings to be able to take off with a bird that size. So some birds don't fly. And flight is one of the amazing things. And one of the things I write about in the book is the Wright brothers. When the Wright brothers were trying to build a human-powered or a plane that would go with an engine, they watched the birds and they imitated the birds. They had a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and it turned out there's a river that runs near there, and there's a sort of cliffs on either side of the river, and they would watch turkey vultures flying around in these the air currents from these cliffs, and they would see how they moved their wings and how they adjusted their wings, and they learned things from the birds that they applied to their planes, and they were very systematic about how they designed the plane and how they tested it. First of all, they had it controlled with cables, and then they tried to glide it, and then they added the engine. So they had different stages. But it's kind of amusing. There was, they went to Kitty Hawk to do their test runs, and the local people thought that, they were never going to be able to get this thing to fly. They just thought these guys were crazy. But there was an interview with one of the local people a few years after they were successful in flight. And this guy was saying that they would watch the Wright brothers on the beach, and they would be moving their arms, and they would be, watching the birds, and they'd be trying to follow the movements of the birds' wings with their arms, and then they would try to, think how that would apply to their plane. And so it's kind of interesting to see how the Wright brothers looked at birds, and that was part of the way that they learned how to make their plane fly.
Yeah, amazing. Well, it's been fascinating learning a bit more about birds and how they work. If people want to read up about it, they should definitely get a copy of your book. It's called Birds Up Close. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Lorna Gibson, who we've been chatting with today. Lorna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.